Hello and welcome to another talk brought to you by physicaltherapycontinuingeducation.org. On the phone today we have Dr. Timothy Hewett. Dr. Hewett is the Director of Sports Medicine Biodynamic Centre at Children's Hospital Research Foundation. He's also a Professor in Pediatrics and Orthopaedic Surgery in the College of Medicine and an Adjunct Professor in Rehabilitation Sciences at the University of Cincinnati and Cincinnati's Children's Hospital Medical Center. Dr. Hewett, welcome to the call.
Sasha, thanks for having me.
Oh, you're welcome. Well, we wanted to get you on the phone today to talk specifically about ACL injuries and more specifically in your work in regarding to prevention of ACL injuries. But before we get into that, could you just give us a little bit more information about your background?
Well, basically, I'm a biophysicist. I was trained in biophysics and finished up my PhD degree in 1990. And then I went on and did 2 postdoctoral fellowships, one in molecular biology and the other in whole organ physiology. And basically, my interests are being able to pull in any tools to ask questions relevant to young athletes, and especially injured young athletes or preventing injuries. And so we have many studies that go on in our laboratory that range from looking at young kids with juvenile rheumatoid arthritis who go back to sports and look at their joint loading patterns to looking at young women and trying to figure out why they have a 2 to 10-fold higher chance of injuring their ACL or developing patellofemoral pain or developing advanced osteoarthritis early in their lives than males do.
Fantastic. So if we just talk a little bit more general about ACLs at this stage, you just alluded to there. It seems like there's a high incidence in females than male adolescents.
Yeah, and this is really well established. People sort of, I don't know if you want to say put the blame, but there's Title IX was enacted in 1973, and what that did is it brought female participation in sport at the collegiate and high school level. It increased it easily 10-fold, 11-fold, and so we're assuming there was always this underlying risk of, and again, depending on the literature you read, anywhere between a 2 and 10 times higher risk of an ACL injury in a young woman versus a young man. And in 1973, when Title IX was enacted, you had still that 5-fold higher risk, but you had 10-fold or more fewer players. So there were still less than half as many young girls and women suffering ACLs than we saw in males. But then when Title IX was enacted and it funneled a bunch of women into collegiate sports, and then it brought all these opportunities which funneled, basically in 1973 you had under 270,000 girls playing high school sports. Now you have about 3.2 million. Wow. Well over 10 times more. And almost the same as boys are playing high school sports. Boys are in the range of 3.3, 3.4 million. And so now we see our clinics full of young girls with ACL tears.
Right.
And we did a study on the north side of Cincinnati here. It's been about 20 years ago now, where we were covering Soccer World, which was an indoor soccer/football arena. And we did a study where we were trying to figure out, they also had outdoor fields, and our athletic trainers were covering both venues. And what we were interested in was this idea is there a higher incidence, is there a higher risk on a turf field versus a grass field? And that's the way we designed the study. Now, these sort of epidemiologic or injury surveillance studies are difficult to do because it's relatively easy to determine the numerator of the equation, how many injuries occur, but the denominator, the amount of exposure, is actually quite difficult to determine in many situations. But at Soccer World, it really wasn't, because what we had was recreational team soccer, ranging from age, say, 18 to 35, and we had young and women. These were co-ed soccer teams, so half males, half females, and they were each game was exactly an hour long, and everyone played throughout the match. So we knew exactly how much exposure all the players had and how much exposure the women and men had. And going in, we had no hypotheses related to differences between males and females. When we looked at the data, there was no statistically significant difference between injury risk on a grass field and a turf field. However, when we looked closer at the data, women had a 6.2 times higher likelihood of tearing their ACL than males. And so we published that in the early 90s, and really at that point, people were surprised by it. But truthfully, that first study was kind of ignored, maybe an aberration. And then what happened is several groups started looking at the data at the NCAA level and started realizing whether you looked at any kind of planting, cutting sport like soccer or basketball or volleyball, what you saw was a sex difference in relative risk that ranged between 2 and 10-fold. So that now in 2010, that's really well established, that women and girls have a significantly higher, let's just say on average about a 5-fold higher risk per exposure. So that's saying if you look at the amount of time they're out on the court, out on the field, and you have that denominator of the equation, you're going to find that women are about 5 times higher risk of an ACL.
Finally, is there any exciting work that you're currently working on that we should keep an eye out for? You mentioned that you might have a DVD coming out showing some of these exercises.
Yeah, we do. Well, there's a couple neat things. Mark Paterno and my group just presented. We won the NCAA award at the AOSSM meeting in Providence, Rhode Island last month. And basically, we're looking at risk factors for second ACL. And basically, what we're finding is these same control problems, these same neuromuscular control problems that lead to first injury risk increase second injury risk to a great extent. So therapists who are working with these kids after an ACL tear and reconstruction, basically the best predictors of future risk were hip external rotation strength. So again, related to the core. If they didn't have good hip external rotation strength on both sides, they had an 8 times higher chance of having another ACL injury. And if they didn't have a lot of frontal plane excursion, if they didn't flex down through the knee and hip, they had significantly greater risk. If they allowed a lot of medial collapse at the knees, they had about a 4.5-fold greater risk. And if they didn't do well on a single leg balance test, one side versus the other, if they showed asymmetries one side versus the other, they had about 3 times greater risk of a second ACL. And this is a huge problem because your risk in the general population and the young female population of tearing their ACL, if they haven't torn before, is somewhere between 1 in 50 and 1 in 100. After they tear their ACL and have a reconstruction, their risk of tearing their ACL again is more like 1 in 4. So therapists have to be aware of these deficits. They were probably there before she tore her ACL. They're probably worse after she tore her ACL because all those mechanoreceptors that were in the ACL are ruptured, torn apart, and gone. So we have to even do greater amounts of neuromuscular control training to make up for that loss of that sensor in the knee. And yes, we put a DVD together that a group of the companies called, you could either find it on our website, which is www.cincinnatichildrens.com/sportsmed, or I'm working with a company called ICSoft, ISEESOFT.com, and we just spent several months putting a DVD using all of our different techniques, especially dynamic core training techniques, onto a DVD, and that should be available within a month or two.
Okay.
I also have, if you Google my name or you search PubMed, there's several studies especially ones that Greg Meyer has taken the lead on. So if you PubMed or Googled Meyer, M-Y-E-R, and Huitt, what you'll do is you'll find several PDFs of studies where we had serial photographs, and I can send these to you, Sasha, these PDFs,
Okay.
where you have, and you can load them up on your website, where we have serial photographs of how we do all these different training techniques.
That'd be excellent. And I'll put those links to those other sites that you mentioned on the site as well.
That would be wonderful.
Very good. Well, Dr. Hewitt, I'd like to thank you very much for coming on today. Lots of great information.
Sasha, it was my pleasure. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Very good. Thank you very much. Well, thank you for listening. We hope you enjoyed this interview. For more great interviews, please visit us at physicaltherapycontinuingeducation.org. That's physicaltherapycontinuingeducation.org. Thank you.